All right, good morning everyone. Welcome to SeaRUG for this wonderful April morning, almost afternoon here. My name is David Diarsa. I'm currently the president of the board for SeaRUG, and typically I get up here and I run through a number of slides and then hand it over to our presenter. This month I'm going to do something a little bit different. If you were here last month, we had a presentation on reality capture, and we had really hoped to get into Revit with the reality capture, and it's something that I've been trying to push the presentations towards, and we didn't quite get there, so I asked for a show of hands. A lot of people wanted to see a little something. So I offered to do a little, to kind of put the final point on that presentation, and Sasha's been very gracious in allowing me a little bit of time to do that. I will tell you, I recorded the screen so that I'm not doing it live. That'll control the time, and I won't be up here at 25 minutes. But I'm going to jump into that and kind of skip over a lot of the initial slides that I usually show, with the exception of I do want to acknowledge our sponsors, just because they're the ones that make this financially possible and keep it free for y'all. So, you know, I can't really gloss over this. I will gloss over the SeaRUG board members. They know who they are. They know that I appreciate their help. So without any further ado, I'm going to talk about using point clouds in Revit. What I was really hoping to show is how we take a point cloud and actually what are the steps are to get it into Revit. And then when it's in Revit, what do we do with it? But more importantly, how do we get confidence behind the quality of the point cloud? And if I tell you that something is in a certain spot because of a point cloud, the guys out in the field are going to question that. So there are some crucial steps to do that, and I'm going to show you AutoCAD, Navisworks, and Revit in this workflow. And frankly, this is something that to me seems, when I was putting together, I kept kind of questioning myself, and I was a little insecure about it because it's something that I think I did for the first time in 2008. So this has to be outdated. There's got to be some people in this audience that are doing something more advanced, you know, whether it be with some of the more advanced features in recap, maybe through shared coordinates, which I'm not a huge fan of, so you'll see that I don't use. But the critical step here is that in this workflow that I'm going to show you, there was a licensed surveyor that was involved. And I will show you a little bit about what we did with that. So here we are. This is the only other point where I'm going to pause this, and then I will promise I'll let it play. I do have a couple of things here that are important to point out. I've got a DWG that is a grid file. That came from Revit. Revit project, create your grid, export that out to AutoCAD. You'll see why in a minute. Then I have a drawing that my surveyor gave to me called survey points. That's the one that's behind my tooltips that are opening up over there. That came from a surveyor who, with his total station, with state plane coordinates, with whatever he needed to use, he said, this is the point where this particular intersection is. I'm certifying that that is the location. So with that, I can create a drawing that matches the two things together, and then I'll let it play. So I've created this origins drawing that I'm going to get into, where I'm going to XREF these things. I'm going to XREF in, and by the way, I'm just showing you I've got an RCP file from recap. The recap structure is that there's this RCS, which actually has the points. So you could import the RCP, but the RCS as well. Doesn't really matter which one you use. Let me get into this origins point drawing, and you can see that I've got all those things XREF'd in. I've XREF'd the point cloud, I've XREF'd the grid that came out of Revit, and I've XREF'd the survey points that the surveyor gave me. Now, we all know that when it comes to surveyors, units are kind of a funny thing. And a lot of times, the point clouds might come in metric. That's why that thing is scaled. Now, AutoCAD takes care of that. Now, you'll see later, AutoCAD takes care of that in a different way than Revit does. So let's kind of put a pin on that. I'm going to make sure that everything that I've inserted here is at 0, 0. I want to make sure my grid is at 0, 0, my survey points are at 0, 0, and my point cloud is at 0, 0. Now, I'm also going to make a copy of that grid, and I'm going to move it to where my surveyor said that intersection of A and 0 are. And there's that line right there. That's the That's that relationship between the two. I've got one copy of my grid at 0, one copy at where the surveyor told me that it is. Now, with that, I can find out my deltas. That's the amount that I need to move that point cloud to get from where it is in the real world or in the surveyor's world to where it is in the Revit model world. Now, here I'm going to show you that I've moved that, I've done that transformation right there into Navisworks. I like Navisworks because it's a very fast way to navigate through model information, and it's a place where I can kind of view it and validate it, and it's a lot quicker than Revit. So I'm just going to move that stuff by that same amount that, that my survey points told me to do it, and I'm going to make sure that everything looks good, and I'm pretty happy with it. So let's do that same operation in Revit. Now, of course, this is going kind of quick. I realize that. I'm happy to expand on this later after the meeting if anybody wants to find out more. But anyway, here's my Revit project. There's my Revit grid that has been exported to DWG. Now I'm back in Revit. I just have a massing, because in your view, you're not going to see the point cloud when you first import it. I like to go out to a 3D view, but grids don't show up in 3D views unless you have 2019, which I didn't when I created this. So I created a mass that allows me to see where that grid is. So now I'm going to bring my RCP into Revit, origin to origin, make sure that things are 0, 0. Now, in my 3D view, I'll be able to see it. Now, of course, I can't see it in the plan because it's off to the side and the elevation's not right and all those things, right? So there's the point cloud. And by the way, this is all real time. I recorded it, but this is real time. This is how quick Revit deals with fairly large point clouds. Now, I should be able to just move this by those deltas that I found out earlier, right? But hey, check this out. I was like at 5,000 feet. Why is this saying 15,000? Well, again, scale. Revit deals with scale differently than Autodesk. So if you look at the type properties of that point cloud, you can see that it has scaled it up. And if you actually tell it 1 to 1, it'll bring it back. Now, that might take a little bit of trial and error. It could be that it's metric, or if it was scanned in feet, you might have to do something a little bit different. But once you figure out the scale, you should be able to put in those values that you discovered earlier in AutoCAD. And basically, it's going to take that point cloud and drop it exactly with the relationship from the real world to your model being correct. Now, the last thing that I need to do here is move it down. It's 100 feet up in the air. And then it'll pop up into our view. So I feel very confident of the placement of that point cloud now. A licensed surveyor has given me those points. He's the one that said that's where that point cloud goes. He's actually the one that got the point cloud, which I think is a separate topic, but very helpful. Now, by default, you're going to see this plan view doesn't look all that great. It's got, you know, where the view is cutting the plane. It's actually, you're kind of seeing the imperfections in the slab there, and there's a lot of clutter. Well, let's clean this up a little bit. The first thing that I'm going to do here, if I remember correctly, because I did this last month, but if you go into your view range, you can actually affect the cutting plane and the view of the depth of your view so that you're not looking at that entire point cloud, but rather a narrow slice of it. Now, just by moving that cutting plane or that bottom up 6 inches, you'll see that I basically get rid of the floor. There's some stuff in here in the middle that's kind of, well, this right there is, you know, clutter. There was something on the side. That could have been cleaned up in recap, by the way. I just didn't. Now, point clouds are funny in that, you know, the closer you get to something, the farther apart the points seem. So if you change the color of the point cloud in Revit, which Revit will let you do with visibility graphics, you can make every point in there black. That starts to actually approximate what a floor plan looks like. Again, if you zoom in, you're going to see kind of individual points, but the beauty of it is you can actually snap to those points. Those are actually Revit points at that point. So I'm playing here with with section planes, some of the depth of section planes. You can see all that information that you're seeing on the screen is a point cloud. There's nothing modeled at this point. And all I'm doing is I'm just going by and cutting sections wherever I want. Some of the other things that you can do with point clouds in Revit is change the visibility so that it shows you normal directions or intensity, which comes in handy during 3D views to kind of see what the information is if you don't have a very dense point cloud. You can put on an elevation mode where you can select what colors at the lowest elevation, what colors at the highest, or you know, you can make it kind of a background like a grayscale background color to then start modeling. So I've been arguing all this time, you do not need to model that truss. That truss is in there. It's actually modeled. It's just in points, but you can see it. If you need to snake some duck through it, you can. Now here's another example, larger point cloud. A number of different scans put together. You can see this is a pretty good as-built. You can go in there and annotate it. You can fill in some blanks, but let's say that I need to put a wall and separate, I'm doing a remodel of this building. I need to put a wall in here. I don't have to model those walls. I don't have to model those columns. They are where they need to be. I can snap to them. So let's just put the new walls in and not worry about the old columns. I mean, what's the problem with that? Why would you want to spend time modeling those columns? I've long argued that modeling those columns, unless you need to do something to them, doesn't give you any value whatsoever. Well, that might be a case where you might want to put a reference plane on there, or maybe you do want to create a model. So now I've got some examples here of some. What you're seeing there are not photos; those are points. Those are 3D views of points, and this is some of the stuff that you can do when you get away from thinking that you have to model everything that's in the point cloud, but rather start using the point cloud as your background and as the model. This project right here could have not been done had we not been basically scanning every week for a year and a half, and basically modeling on top of what that point cloud was. So anyway, that's it. I just kind of wanted to show that. It's some very basic stuff. I'm happy to elaborate on that and talk to anybody after the meeting, but I definitely want to hand this over to Ideate and let them. I believe that they have an announcement to make, and then we have a pretty good presentation by Sash over here on parameters.
All right. That's the punchline. Thanks, David. So. I told Sash I'd only take 45 seconds, so I'll try to keep it to that. Ideate and Imaginate have merged here in the region. My name is Greg Bao. I'm with Imaginate. I have a couple folks here with me. Bob Rice has been with Imaginate, and Brian Keeley has been with Ideate, so we're all working together now. For some of you who have dealt with us out in the field, now there are fewer of us to deal with, but a couple of just points of clarity, and then for anybody who has any concerns about this, we're more than happy to talk with you afterwards. There's been a bit of a split at Ideate, so Imaginate has taken on the Autodesk software reseller services side of the Ideate business. There's now another Ideate software business that remains that will continue to develop Ideate software as well as providing other complementary solutions such as Bluebeam. I know Sash is quite an expert in Bluebeam. Some background behind that, we are a platinum partner with Autodesk. We're a provider of BIM 360 solutions all the way into the construction market. We've got a technical team that does that. Autodesk does not like us selling competitive solutions such as Bluebeam. So I will make a plug here for the Ideate software business that any of your Bluebeam needs, they can most certainly handle, and they do have a good technical team, more than just Sash, that can help with those. So that's hopefully 45 seconds or less. We'll be here, and we're happy to address this, and thank you.
All right. How's everyone doing today? Super excited to be here? Yes, we do, right? We absolutely love parameters. So full disclosure, real quickly, this is probably more of a heavier PowerPoint type presentation. If my Revit doesn't crash, we can get into Revit. Apparently it's failed twice on me, so I'm not sure what's up with that. I love computers. But let's get back to this. We do love parameters, right? That's kind of the big question, right? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk all things parameters and hopefully clarify any sort of questions, complications, whatever you may have. I'm here to help out with that. All right, so a little about me. Wait, we have the Camtasia going. That's normally what I look like, but I've gotten away with this beard now for a couple of years, so I'm doing pretty well with it. I'm going to continue keeping this beard, but if you ever want to know what I look like, otherwise, that's me. I'm located in our Portland, Oregon office, so I'm actually with Ideate software, as we kind of talked about earlier. So I'm on the Ideate software side of things, so I handle all things Ideate software related. I am a California licensed architect, and I've been with Ideate now for 5 years, so actually a little more than 5 years. So my big focus is on the Revit platform and also the Bluebeam platform as well. All right, I'm not going to read this. Nobody wants to read this. This is a lot of words, but there's a lot of parameter information in the Revit environment, and so I'm going to focus on some of the parameters today. But the nice thing is, you can create your own parameters for your own needs. Otherwise, if you couldn't create parameters, I probably wouldn't be using Revit, right? Because then they're kind of forcing you to use only their parameters. So we're going to go into a little bit more, dig a little bit deeper into the I portion of BIM, and we'll see where this goes. All right, so I'm going to talk about some of the common data pitfalls related to parameters. I'll talk about some of the basics, and then this whole sharing portion over here, what is it all about, and maybe some tips and tricks. By the way, feel free to weigh in at any point in time. If there's something you disagree with or completely agree with, I definitely want to hear from you. All right, so just a few things I wanted to put up here real quickly. How many of you have ever just tried to click in there and nothing happens? Everybody should be nodding their head, right? All right, so why can't you edit this field? We've run into that all the time. Or why can't you edit that field? That's another one. And especially, when I was a new Revit user, that stuff drove me crazy. I'd be clicking here, I'm like, why can't I not edit this information? So again, I'm going to clarify some of this. How many of you run into this situation before? This is a really fun one. And it's so weird. You're like, wait, how can I have two of the same parameters? Like you go to schedule something in your Revit model and you go, okay, I have two of these, or maybe more. And unfortunately, you can easily do that in your Revit model. Has everybody run into this before? Okay, awesome. And there's a few good reasons for why that kind of stuff can happen to you. How about this? I was guilty of this, especially early on when I thought, oh, I'll just make parameters for everything. And I found myself going into all of my families that I had for my company, and I was like, I got to make all these custom shared parameters. So I would go in and open up all my door families and stuff some parameters in there. And then, of course, when I knew better, when I learned later on what really to do, I was like, wow, that was a huge waste of time. Speaking of a waste of time, then I realized, oh, I need to add more parameters. So what do? I go back into all of my families, and I'm thinking, this software is absolutely insane. Why would I have to do that? And then I found out the truth about parameters. All right, so I'm going to give you just some basics with parameters here. How many of you are parameter experts? It's okay. Just one person. All right, perfect. All right, so let's get into some parameter basics. So kind of compiled a list of the different types of parameters that exist in the Revit model. Now, if you go to like the Autodesk help file, they don't list all of these as parameters, so maybe we've kind of made some things up. But in my opinion, I think reporting, or actually more like calculated values of tags, that's some sort of parameter, right? And calculated values themselves. There's system parameters, as we kind of call them, which are the hard-coded built-in parameters that come with Revit, the ones that we wish we could delete or rename, right? Those ones. The ones I'm going to focus on today are mainly the project parameters and the family parameters. Now, I have a couple here that I'm calling project shared and family shared. That's not really a true term, I guess, in Revit. I've never heard of family shared or project shared. But it's the difference of where the parameter was created, whether it was created within the family itself or within the project. So that's why we're kind of breaking them out. And then I am briefly going to talk about global parameters. Who here uses global parameters? Okay, I have some questions for you in like 10 minutes. Okay. All right, so some of this may seem very elementary to you, but nonetheless, I want to kind of get this out there. So what are some of the ways you can create parameters in Revit? Well, you can go to a schedule and add a parameter from there, right? That's pretty easy. And of course, if you add a parameter from a schedule, if you go to the Manage tab and then to the Project Parameters button, you'll see that parameter show up in there. It's just a quicker way of getting to it through the schedule itself, all right? You can also get to it from the Family Editor. And if you look at the two dialog boxes, they look the same, but I think there's some really good information to read right here, where a schedule parameter can appear in schedules but not in tags. See, also here can appear into schedules or tags. You see the difference right there? So those are the things you want to kind of keep in mind, even though the dialog boxes kind of look the same. So something to kind of, I know, right? They don't really make them exactly clear. Then there's the global parameters. These are kind of fascinating. I think Autodesk introduced these maybe a couple of versions back, and we're like, oh, this is exciting. I'm thinking, okay, what are we going to use this for? So I'll have some questions for everybody on that in a moment. And then there's also the project parameters add. So this dialog box is very similar to this one over here, in that this one asks you to pick what categories you want to apply those parameters to. As you know, if you're in a project and you're going to add a parameter, you can add it to multiple categories. And then the thing to keep in mind is, depending on the parameter type, whether it's a type parameter or an instance parameter, some of these categories will either appear or disappear, okay? So for example, like rooms, there are no type parameters for rooms. Did you guys know that? Rooms and areas do not have type-based parameters. They only have instance-based parameters, which is probably one of the reasons why when you go to phasing, rooms don't show up in the next phase. That's probably part of the reason why that happens, and for other reasons as well. Okay, some other things about instance versus type parameters. Again, some of this may seem, somewhat fundamental, but, instance parameters are kind of on a one-by-one instance, right? So those would be things, if you were to look at maybe some hard-coded Revit parameters, those would be things like a mark value, right? So if you look at like a door has a mark value, door 101, 101A, whatever it may be, all right? And then maybe if you look at type parameters, that's for the actual type itself. So if you look at this beautiful toilet over here, they may have certain type-based parameters like percent of recycled content, right? So that may be a type-based parameter where over here, maybe if you're going to assign it some sort of ASI number, maybe for tracking purposes, maybe during bidding, you want to keep track of where that toilet showed up under the ASI. That would be kind of on a per toilet basis, not for all of these particular toilets. Does that make sense, the difference between the instance and the type parameters? All right, so again, you have to specify that. Does everybody understand the differences between values are aligned per group type versus per instance? Does everybody understand that? Or have you ever really paid attention to that? No? All right, so the big difference, actually this is kind of cool, I'm glad they introduced this, because this hasn't been around forever, all right? But the differences are if you put these families inside of a group, and then let's say you copy the group over, are those parameters going to be assigned to that whole group type, or will you allow them to vary in each one of the group instances? That's actually kind of a big deal, right? Otherwise, what do? Do you make another group just so you can have different parameters in it? So the idea of allowing Revit to kind of fudge this a little bit and have the same group type but allow some of the parameter data to vary, that's kind of a big deal. So don't ignore that. I think a lot of people do when they create parameters. It's like, yep, I'll check a few things and hit OK. This really does have some important implications. Can that? Yes, I believe you can edit it later. Some of the bummer stuff with parameters is once you make a parameter and you come back, you're like, shoot, it's grayed out. And you're like, darn it, I edited that thing like 500 times, and when you go to delete it, it says you're going to delete the parameter and all the data, and you're like, oh, that's not good either. So be aware, like, take your time to make the parameters, right? But if I remember correctly, you can. We'll double check and we'll look at that just to make sure. Also, does anybody use the tooltips? Yes, all right, that's good too, right? So put a tooltip in there if you're going to make a parameter. Tell the user what is the purpose of that parameter. Especially if you make really weird parameters, it probably helps to give a little bit of a tooltip in there. So that's when you hover over the parameter itself, like in the properties dialog box, it pops up a tooltip and tells you what to do. All right, so a little bit of inside the family itself. There are some system parameters, all right? Again, those are the hard-coded parameters that are part of the Revit database. Manufacturer is one of them, right? That's one of the hard-coded parameters. The model. Also the type comment. Now again, we're looking inside the family. And when I talk about type comment, we have comments versus type comments. But what you're not going to see as an actual parameter inside the family in terms of system parameters are like the mark value. And once you load that family into your project, that mark value shows up as part of kind of the appended data. Does that make sense? And so be thinking about that appended data, especially if you don't do a lot of parameter stuff. I want you to be thinking about that. So again, you will not see type mark inside the family. It's when you load it up into the project that type mark parameter shows up. So that's kind of at a system level. Revit has control of that. You don't have that kind of control. Then, of course, you have custom parameters. And when we say unshared, we're talking more about family parameters. So things like, I don't know, maybe it's a width parameter or some sort of parameter that allows you to stretch the geometry out, but you don't care to schedule it. Does that make sense? So it's more of family related parameters. That's one example. Like I used to model a bunch of casework, and I'd have all these parameters that drive the geometry. I don't care to schedule that stuff. All right? If I don't, that becomes a non-shared parameter that's built inside the family. It's just to drive the geometry itself. Once it's loaded up into the project, you won't see that parameter show up in the schedule. Does that make sense? And again, when you create parameters, you have to be very careful about the types of parameters that you create, because otherwise you're going to get a whole bunch of data that shows up in your Revit model that you're never going to edit, or it's going to make your list of parameters in your schedules this long when it only needs to be this long. So those are the kinds of things that you want to be careful of. Then we have shared parameters. I guess we're going to call this family shared because we can create the shared parameter within the family. And again, the reason why we create these is, number one, we want to be able to schedule it. All right? Number two, it may drive geometry. It could be a material parameter of sorts. You have a whole slew of parameter types. Okay? But the advantage of that is when I load it up into the project, I have the availability to schedule that parameter if I want to. And also, when you do a shared parameter, the other advantage of it is you can tag it. All right? So sometimes I ask people when they create parameters, they say, oh, I'm going to make all shared parameters. I'm like, really? You don't need to do that. Are you going to tag it? Well, no. Okay. Do you care to schedule it? No. Then don't even bother creating a shared parameter. You don't need to do that.
One other thing it'll help for too, if you're making parts,
yeah.
There's a dimension with a width or something.
Yep.
You don't want it to write to another width parameter. You want it to be comparing the same parameter with the same ID, and the shared parameters will do that. So once it swaps, it'll keep that width or whatever value you have.
And we're going to talk a little bit about those parameters as well. That's a very good point. Okay, so inside the project itself, the different types of parameters. Global parameters. Now, global parameters are on a per project basis. So for those of you that are using global parameters, can some of you kind of tell me what you're using them for? Chris, you kind of waved your hand. I went to school with Chris, so I'm going to pick on him first. That helped. Okay, perfect. And did you have for the dimensional parameters, right? They were a dimension-based parameter. Did you have that like in a working view so you can, so it wasn't interfering in your working drawings? Okay. Who else would like to be picked on for a moment? Anybody? Yes. Yep. A lot of ceilings. So another great example, right? Move all your ceilings at once. The ones I've used them for are maybe my company has a standard in terms of like door jambs to adjacent walls, right? You know, when you cram that door really close to the adjacent wall, nobody can get framing in there, let alone you can't get an actual door frame or trim work around it. So you say, look, we're going to make everything 4 inches. So you snap a dimension to all your door jambs for, where the adjacent walls are, and in one click of a button, I can move all of those, right? So that's another example. And other ones I've seen too are like the top beams to the floor relationship, and if you change the floor itself, the thickness, what happens is that floor will run into the beam. So you can snap a global parameter to that, and basically in one click, when you change the floor, you can get the beams to move with it so that they're not going inside of the floor thickness. So there are some uses for global parameters. I just haven't heard anybody tell me all the most amazing reasons. So again, if you have some ideas, I would definitely like to hear from you about that later on. But nonetheless, they're there. The interesting thing, as I mentioned before about global parameters, is they're not assigned to any particular category of elements in Revit. When you make a global parameter, I didn't assign that door to adjacent wall to the door category. It's just a parameter that I created. I can assign it to anything I really want to. Same with your ceiling dimension, right? You snapped it to a ceiling, but it doesn't belong to a particular category. So there's I like some of that where you can use that parameter for more than one purpose. Does that make sense? All right. Then you have project shared parameters. So again, you're creating a shared parameter within the project, and we'll talk about that as well. And then project parameters. This is probably the most widely used type of parameter. So the whole thing about the project parameters themselves is they're created in the project, they can be scheduled, but they cannot be tagged. And then you assign them to categories. So if I make a special dimensional parameter, I can assign that to multiple categories in Revit, and when I go to schedule that information, that parameter will show up in that schedule. But you cannot tag it. So if you want to tag it and have that information read in a tag, you have to make it a shared parameter. Does that make sense? So keep that in mind. And then you have the system-based information like project info. That's hard-coded into Revit. Room and space data like room name and room number. And of course, system families themselves have tons of system-based parameters. Again, you don't create them. Revit has them created for you. You can't delete them. You can't rename them. They're just hard-coded. And things like the mark value and the fire rating, those are hard-coded parameters. So we call those what? System parameters. Does that make sense? And I remember when I first got into Revit, I'm like, how do I rename this parameter? How do I delete it? And you can't. Okay, this is not working out so well. Oh, you know what? What did I do here? Hang on one sec. Just turn it off and turn it back on. I've been hitting buttons on this thing and okay, we'll get there. Okay, now I'm just really frustrated with this. Sorry, folks. When in doubt, just pull the thing and put it back in. If it has more than 2 buttons, I can't figure it out. Okay, well, we'll just do this. There we go. All right. I think it may have frozen on me. All right, so again, global parameters I mentioned before, they're specific to a particular project. They're not assigned to a category, and you can copy via TPS, not TPS reports, like from our favorite movie. It's the transfer project standards, right? So something to kind of keep in mind. So you create a global parameter, you can assign it to multiple categories within a Revit model. By the way, if you're wondering why you saw these little buttons within your parameters in your project, that's because you can assign them those global parameters. And then look at this, like here's your door from adjacent wall. That's an example of a global parameter. And if you don't want that to schedule, or if you don't want to actually see that in your view, I usually make like a working view to actually show that. Okay, I think this is bordering on what we were kind of just talking about. This one kind of boggles my mind a little bit. Linked file parameters. All right, if you make a project parameter in project A, and then you make the same parameter name in project B, and you link project A into B with the same exact parameter name, believe it or not, it will schedule. Have you guys noticed that? Okay, that's a big, big deal. What's a bummer Well, no, it's not a bummer, right? Because you'd be editing somebody else's model. But when you schedule that information, if you click in some of the fields and you cannot edit it, that may be one of the reasons why, because it's from a linked file. All right? So keep that in mind, that if you're working with a consultant, I've worked with some folks that are on the interior side and on the core and shell side, and somebody's making a schedule, like let's just pick on a door schedule because that's an easy one. But if they make a door schedule and you guys have the same parameter names, let's say it's a special parameter for doors, and you link theirs in and you schedule it, their data will show up in your model. Okay, it will show up in the schedule. Now, you cannot edit the data within the schedule that's from their file because it's part of a link. Okay, so if you need to edit that data, it's always best to ask your consultants to do it, right? Don't do it yourself because you're editing somebody else's information, which is not good. Okay, so that's one of the things. I think this is kind of what we were kind of talking about earlier, right? So project 1, project 2, if they both have a parameter called serial number and it's applied to the same category, it's spelled exactly the same, they will schedule in the same schedule together. Does that make sense? So that's something to kind of keep in mind. You do not need to make it a shared parameter. Again, you can get it to schedule, but you can't tag it. If you need to tag it with the serial number, it has to be a shared parameter. Make sense? Now, for linked files, if you have shared parameter data and you want it to show up in the same column, it has to have the same GUID. Does anybody know what GUID stands for? You would think so, but it's not. Yeah, yep, global unique identification, that is correct. You just got the $1,000 question on Jeopardy. Nice work. Yes, that's very, very important. So this is a big, big deal. How many of you are guilty of this, but you try to recreate a parameter, and you're like, oh, I'll just make a new parameter with the same name, and then it'll tag. You ever done that before? You go tag something, and it can't find the tag information, so you go make your own tag, and you make a parameter that's exactly the same name, and you go tag it, and it still won't report the info. You've never done that before? Man, that's like the first thing I did in Revit when I didn't know anything. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? You go to tag something in your Revit model, you don't have a tag for it, it's a custom element. You go, you look at the parameter name, it says serial number, so you make your own parameter called serial number in your tag, and then you go to tag it and it still won't report it. We've all done this. Some of us have, apparently you haven't done it before. All right, but I've done it because I thought I would get it to work and it won't tag. And the reason why is this GUID right here, the global unique identifier, right there. That's the reason why. In order for it to be able to schedule the same, you have to have the same shared parameter. Okay, you can't make up a new parameter the same name as a shared parameter. It will not work. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that in a moment. All right, sharing is caring. We all know that, right? We've been told that our whole lives. All right, so the thing about manufacturers is a lot of them want to basically kind of brand themselves, right? And so if you want your data to show up in schedules, then you need to actually make it a shared parameter. Anybody using like IFC? Does anybody working in other platforms, maybe somebody working with somebody in ArchiCAD, you have to export out to IFC? Okay, so if you need to export any of that data, if you need a higher level of consistency, you need to be using shared parameters, all right? And then COBie, anybody doing COBie? No. So do you know what COBie stands for? You do? Yeah. So she knows COBie, right? Construction Operations Building Information Exchange, I believe is what it is, right? So same thing, if you need some of that data, you gotta be using shared parameters. All right, and again, as I told you before, shared parameters can apply to families and or the project. So this is where I'm getting that family shared and project shared information. Okay, this is the GUID that I'm talking about. How many of you have gone into a shared parameters file before and try to read it? All right, and I've actually grafted information, even though it tells you right in there, do not edit the file. I've totally gone into that. It's not that big of a deal, just take a risk, all right? Copy the original and then take a risk. It's not that big of a deal. If you just kind of read, I think everything's all tab delineated basically, but if you go in there, you can totally graft information in there. What you don't want to be doing is making up a GUID. That's probably not a good idea. Maybe it is. I don't really know. But I have two toilets here. All right. Again, I'm just using toilets. And they both have the same parameter name in this case, Ideate compliant. But the problem is, the reason why, number one, there's two things. There's two of them in my schedule, but they both behave differently. I, for example, couldn't put a check mark in this Ideate compliant over here because it applies to that parameter. And the reason why is the GUID is different between the two of them. That's the reason why if you ever try to make up your own parameter name that matches something and it won't tag, it's because the global unique identifier in there is different. That's the thing about it, okay? That's the reason why a tag, when you tag an element, can report the information from that element because the GUIDs match. When you make a tag family in Revit, you have to pick the shared parameter. That way the GUIDs match up and it says, I can talk to you. But if you don't make a match, it's not gonna work out. Does that make sense? That's a big, kind of a big thing. I'm not gonna read this out loud. I'll leave it up here for a moment, but this is actually a big deal. Do your parameters need to be shared or not? Again, you do not want to make a shared parameter for every single situation, okay? You don't need to do that. But if you're dealing with title blocks, Kobe information, IFC, that kind of stuff, you want to make it a shared parameter, okay? Whether it's project or family. Also, if you want to use a special parameter for a filter, that's actually kind of interesting. I'll talk about that in a moment, all right? Now, also, if you want to make a parameter for a particular category, but you don't want that parameter to be available to every element in that category. So let's say it's something electrical, all right? Something electrical. If you make a special parameter, you only want it to apply to certain elements within that electrical fixtures category, but not to everything, then you may want to consider making it a shared parameter within that family itself, okay? And if you're a manufacturer, you probably want everything to be shared, all right? And I'll leave this up to, I'll just kind of, I'm not going to, read everything over here, but if you just don't care to schedule anything, if you don't care to tag it, but you want to schedule it, then you have some decisions to make whether you want them to be shared parameters or not. And if you want to review this again, I know this video will be available on the SeaRUG site, so you can take a snapshot of it, and I won't yell at you for copyrighted stuff. All right. If you're dealing with title blocks or tags for that matter, you got to make them shared. Matter of fact, Revit, when you're in the title block family itself, and you go to edit label, it will force you to a shared parameter. Okay, you'll just go right in there, you go hit new parameter, you're like, oh, that's my only choice. All right, so there you have it. I made one here for a project phase as just an example. It's a shared parameter. Or here's another example here, for occupancy tags. If you wanted to actually get the data from a schedule and kind of push it up into a tag, we won't talk about the merits behind that. There's still some issues to this day with that process, but same kind of thing. You need to make it a shared parameter. Okay, if you don't make it a shared parameter, you can't schedule it. All right, as I mentioned before, if you want to go to other databases, by the way, that's what ODBC stands for. Sometimes I forget that, so I decided to put that up there just to remind everybody. But these kinds of databases will not export like project parameters. They have to be a shared parameter or like a family shared parameter in order for that information to export. And I'm not an expert on all the different databases that are out there, but other databases will also benefit from the use of shared parameter data. Okay, so you can see the power behind that. So again, when you make the parameters and you know you need to go out to a database, you may want to consider making it a shared parameter at that point. Cool? This is what I was talking about earlier, using a shared parameter as a filter. Actually, I didn't even know this until just recently. I had no idea. I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. And I went in, I tested it out, and sure enough, it worked. So shared parameters can actually be used with the parameter exists feature, which is kind of cool. Because I was trying this with project parameters. I'm like, let me just create a quick project parameter and see if I can build a filter and just use that parameter, and it doesn't show up in my list. And then so I made a parameter called filter me. As a shared parameter itself, and made that within the project, and sure enough, it actually works. So that's kind of cool. So if you're looking at doing some sort of special filtering, you may want to consider using a shared parameter to do that. Did you guys, how many of you knew this? Sweet, nice. All right, I did not know that until that, I mean, full disclosure, so I don't know everything. Got it. Got it. So basically, in your example with the emergency fixtures, you made that parameter, you applied it to the all emergency lighting, and you probably filled in some sort of data in there, or did you only? Cool. That's awesome. And you did it as a shared parameter. Nice work. Yeah, so there's a great example of what was done. Okay. Here's a little quick quiz that I want to show you, see if you guys kind of absorbed all this data here. All right, so I have an example. We're using the electrical equipment. I did this for you. I was thinking that you were going to be here weeks ago, so I went ahead and did it this way. All right, so I have an electrical equipment category, all right? And I have two families. One's a generator.rfa, and another one's like a utility switchboard. And then I have some custom parameters. These are not parameters that are built into Revit. So let's say I have the first parameter over here called chassis material, all right? And let's say that material applies to the generator, it does not apply to the generator, excuse me, but applies to the utility switchboard. Should I make this parameter a family parameter, like a family shared parameter, or should I make it a project parameter? What's that? He says family, and he is correct, right? Because it pertains only to this, not to this. Does that make sense? Because again, if you make it a project parameter, it's going to apply that parameter field to all of the electrical equipment category of elements, right? So when you make it a family shared parameter, within that family itself, then that parameter will only be editable for that particular element. Does that make sense? So that's something to kind of keep in mind. So if that parameter shows up for every other electrical equipment, you can't edit the field in there. That's what it is. And I'll show you that in a moment when we get into Revit. Hopefully it doesn't crash. All right, exhaust gas flow rate. Hopefully your utility switchboard doesn't have an exhaust gas flow rate. That's kind of weird. I would be really concerned. But for generator, that makes more sense. So again, what kind of parameter would that be? That's probably way too obvious. I gotta make this harder. Yep, family shared, right? All right, and what about barcode? Barcode's a good one, right? If it applies to both, what should you make it? Bingo. You guys are learning all of this. Okay, good, this is all making sense. It applies to project because I don't want to go into every one of my families and make a shared parameter for that when I can just make it a project parameter. Because when you make the project parameter for the electrical equipment category, when you schedule that category, that barcode field will be available and you can edit it. Does that make sense? Sweet. All right, so as I mentioned before, manufacturers typically want to brand themselves. If you've downloaded a lot of their families, you know exactly what I'm talking about. They stuff a lot of data in there. But if you want this information to be available in a schedule, you should make it a family shared parameter. And again, this is kind of a repeat, but be aware of, if you're a manufacturer, please give the end user a break. Nothing like going through the through your schedule and seeing a list of like a ton of parameters. That's just, and it's really hard to sort through that stuff, and then you're afraid to delete them because you don't know what's going to happen. Trying to go back sometimes in the families and cleaning out that data. A lot of times they'll stuff a lot of formulas in there, and you know what happens? You're like, oh, this is really easy, and you start deleting things, and then you break the family. So just be aware of, if you are on the manufacturing side, just be aware of the parameter types that you're creating. Again, if you need it to be scheduled for branding purposes, or it's really that important, then sure, you make it a family shared parameter. But if there's no purpose for it, then make it a family parameter. Don't make it shared at all, so that we don't have to go through this long list of nauseating parameters that only apply to the one component that I dropped in my model from your website. Does that make sense? Does everybody have a process for vetting families? How many of you go to Revit City and just hit load family? Yes. I used to do that too. And it was great, you click on it, it says, furniture.1358.rfa. You're like, okay, cool, furniture 1358. So just be aware of, before you actually even load a family from the manufacturer, it's a good idea to open that family, clean it up, vet it, and then you can use it. All right. Real quickly, a couple other things with scheduling. For schedules themselves, system parameters themselves, those are all built within the Revit project, so they end up just being, you have to make them as a project parameter. So if you want to apply a parameter to a wall or a ceiling or a floor, those are all system-based families. You have to make it a project parameter. I guess you can make it a shared parameter if you want to, but for schedule data, it's best just to make it a project parameter. And we're assuming you don't need to tag it, okay? But if you need to tag it, then you need to make it a shared parameter. How's it going? All right, so custom family, again, I'll leave this up here for just a moment, but there are decisions whether you need to make type-based data or instance data. And the thing about the type data, if you want the values to be consistent across all projects, you're best off making it a shared family parameter. But if it can vary from project to project, then just make it a project parameter. It's not that big of a deal, all right? But think about the consistency versus more project specific. And the same thing goes with instance data. If you have anything that impacts size or material, then consider making it a shared family parameter. Also, you can schedule that information as well. If it's just some text-based stuff, you can look at doing a project parameter or key schedule as well. And I like key schedules. I use them for a lot of things. Okay, that's my data pitfall. All right, so a couple things, and then I'll look at some Revit examples, or if you guys have any questions, we can dive into some of the Revit stuff. But going back to the original slides that I had here, you have if you have a particular parameter in here that's just, you're clicking in it and you can't edit it, what could be going on? Well, it may be that you can go edit the actual shared parameter from the schedule. So did you know this? That if you load up a family, let's say it's a family from a manufacturer and they have a really awesome parameter in there, all right? You load it up, it kind of auto-schedules because there's some data in there, but now you like that parameter and want that parameter for your other components as well. The good news is you can actually go to the schedule and you can select this add elements to all the categories, and then you can check what categories you want that to be applied to, and then you can come back and start putting check boxes or whatever the parameter type is. You can fill out that data. So that's kind of cool, right? So Revit gives you that ability to do that. And when you do that, if you go up to your Manage tab and to your project parameters, you'll see that parameter show up in there. Okay, so I like to do it from a schedule itself. So that's one tip if you run into that situation. Another one is, what if you can't edit that parameter? You're clicking and you're like, that's not supposed to be a Kohler toilet, it's supposed to be something else, but you're clicking and clicking and you're having no luck. Why is that? Well, it could be a couple of things. Number one is, was the parameter actually made read-only? Okay, how many of you have done this before to families? Cool, all right. The reason why you do this is, here's actually a good example of manufacturer. If you went to the manufacturer's website and you downloaded a particular component, and it is the component is parametric, so you can have maybe 5, 6 sizes or 6 types of that family. You don't want to go in there under kind of the instance by instance data and type in the same manufacturer name each time. You can go to the Formula tab and put that in there, and it will be hard-coded in there, so when you load up the family, you end up with this result. That's kind of cool, right? Just bear in mind that every time you make a new type, it's going to repeat that information there. So if it has to vary, then you don't want to make it read-only, because every time you make a new type, you'll get the same manufacturer. All right, if you have duplicate parameters, what do you do in this situation with the duplicate parameters? This is kind of problematic. Well, you can pick one and hide the other. There's some disadvantages to that, because then if If you hide one, then you're going to have to make that other parameter available to the rest of those components, right? Because what you're doing is you're just kind of going back and forth and putting checkboxes where you can. That just looks hokey, right? So you could certainly hide one and then use the apply to all elements and make it available for the rest of the families. You can delete one and keep the other. Yep, that's kind of bad. You could also export out to your share parameter file and then use that for the other families, and then you can delete the one that you don't want. Our software, we've done it before. We export out to Excel and copy the data from the bad one and paste it in the new one and bring the data back in. That's another option as well. You can use other software like Dynamo to do that kind of stuff. Whatever floats your boat, you can certainly do that. Here's an example here where you can export that out. By the way, have you guys run into this situation before where the export button is not available? I know I make it look easy here, like this is all checked and that export's available, but if you run into a situation where the export is grayed out, check to see if you have a shared parameters file loaded. If you don't have a shared parameters file loaded, then you can't export it because where are you going to write it to? So you'll have to go load up the shared parameters file in order to export that information out. Make sense? If you're missing a parameter, how many of you are missing parameters files? You got a new BIM manager job, right? And you're like, the last BIM manager deleted the shared parameters file on their way out the door. Sure, why not? You're upset. You're upset. If I was upset, I would delete the shared parameters file and walk out the door, wouldn't you? Just that little thing that nobody finds immediately until later on. All right, so if you've done, yeah, now you're being, yeah. Oh, no, I have nothing to worry about. I'm good. All right, so don't do this to people. All right, don't do this to people, but if you're upset, the good news is if you do it, somebody can come back now that they've taken this, they've gone to the SeaRUG group, you can certainly export this data out again, and when you export it, what it does is because the global unique identifier is still, that information is still in the family, it'll write it into that text file. Again, if you haven't loaded up a share parameters file, that button will not be available, so make sure you load one up, and then you can go back and recreate that share parameters file, and then you can get on LinkedIn and say, hey, thanks for deleting that file, and anyhow. And what it usually does is it will create its own parameter group inside of there, and so you can go back in and change the group name afterwards. Please don't do that, by the way. And then this is that read-only. When you're inside of a family, if you put information in the formula tab, it will become read-only, okay? So that way when it's loaded up in the project, it's grayed out, so you can't go in and edit it. You'd have to go back to the family to do that stuff. And that's another reason why if you schedule that data and you're clicking in it, you're like, why can't I edit this? That's probably one of the reasons why you can't edit it. Make it stretchy? Sure, I guess. I mean, it just depends. I wouldn't want everything to be stretchy, if you know what I mean. I don't want to drop a 36 by 84 door in there and then stretch it out, because it's not a 36 by 80. We've all run into that before. You're like, that is not a 36 by 84 door. That's some random number now. So be careful if you make it stretchy. But the cool thing is when you're in the family, it's really weird when you go into the family types dialog box, you can't change it to instance parameter in there. You have to go find the dimension, select it, and then click instance parameter, and then you can make it stretchy. How many of you use this? Insert from schedule. Yes, awesome. If you have parameters in another file and you want it in your project, you can insert from another project file and it will bring those parameters forward. So like I've done that with the occupancy calculation stuff before. It's like, oh, I know this stuff exists in another project. Let me bring that information in. And also transfer project standards, global parameters. If you have a really sweet project with all those global parameters and you want those in your other project, you can actually use transfer project standards to bring in global parameters. If you have no global parameters, it won't show up in that list of parameters, I guess. All right, so this is kind of what we talked about. Let me just dive into Revit here for a few minutes since I have a few extra minutes here. Any questions so far? Yes. So you created a parameter in the family, and you need to schedule it now. All right, I'm picking up what you're putting down. So now you want to go ahead and make it schedulable. So you made it as a family parameter that is not shared. Right. So, and the problem is you're probably afraid to delete that parameter, right? Yeah, what would you do? What have you done, I guess? Yep. Yep, you'll have to do the same names, yep. Yep. Like old. Yes. Now, that extension, is that an Autodesk? Yeah, okay, so there is an Autodesk extension that will convert that. There was another parameter tool, I think it's no longer available anymore, where you can basically migrate over your shared parameters, and they took that tool away. Do you remember what it was called? It was like a batch convert or something. That tool, long time ago, people weren't too happy that it disappeared on them, but I think that was last available in like 2014 or 15. Was it even before that? Oh gosh. From project to project. You were stuck, yeah. Yep. Any other questions or tips and tricks? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I've done that before. So that's actually good advice. So what you do, you basically create a formula that refers to the other parameter. You just say it equals that value. That's a great one. That's a kind of a, now of course, if nobody knows that, like you're going to that family, like why did they make this equal that? May want to put a tip in there, right? Put a tooltip and say, ignore what I've done here. This is, see what I'm saying? Otherwise people think that's just the weirdest thing, but see, those tooltips are super helpful. Yeah, and I would probably put a word in there like workaround for perimeter. Yeah. Correct. Yeah, some of them have. Yep. Yes. And it shows up. Yeah, so that's the other thing too. I mean, that's good advice. Like, if you're going to make another parameter, try to be aware of like existing parameters that use the same name. You know, so if you made a perimeter one, maybe you call it foundation perimeter. So it's like, see, fine, FDN perimeter, right? That's what you have to be very careful of. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yep. And that's exactly, see, there's a few tricks that you can do with that as well. So that's actually good advice. I'll just show you real quickly just a couple things. I think, oh, my Revit, wait a minute. I did not open it again, so it's back. I have no answers for that. All right, so let me just do this real quickly here. I'm going to just come over. I'll just show you a couple. I just made some really simple files over here. So here's, you know, a couple or a few plumbing fixtures over here where this was has a family shared parameter that's called Ideate compliant. And then this one here is no family shared parameter. So we never actually added a shared parameter to this family itself. And the same thing with this. Now, these all belong to the plumbing fixtures category. And so the issue is, you know, when you run into the schedule, you're like, oh, this is supposed to be ADA compliant. But you can hear I'm clicking, right? And you can keep clicking all you want. It's never going to work, right? So this is what I'm talking about right here, all right? So again, if you want to have this availability, I guess you have to look at it in two ways. If that field can apply to other families, then you need to make that a shared parameter, right? But if it only applies to certain elements, then you don't necessarily have to make it a shared parameter within the project itself. But what I want to point out is if I come back over here and select this parameter, this is what I was talking about right here. You see it says add to all elements in the selected categories. That's actually pretty sweet. Now before I do that, because I don't want to give away all the answers right now, what I'm talking about here is if I go to edit family and I look at this parameter over here, there it is, the ADA compliant, and I go to the edit parameter, it was done as a shared parameter. Okay, so I created it as a shared parameter. Okay, I gave it a name, By the way, there's some of the editable, you see, you can't go back and change your mind afterwards, be like, oh no, that's not supposed to be a yes, no parameter, right? So once you make it, be very careful about how you make it. But the idea is that when I added that and I loaded it, okay, then what it did, it brought that parameter data in, and so when you go to the schedule, it's an available field, okay, whoops. There's your available field that we were talking about. It brought that data in. Now, if I come back real quickly to this one and go to Edit Family, when I look under the family types, there is no information in here about that ADA compliance. So I could have picked this up from one manufacturer and then another manufacturer, right? Or somebody in my office made it a shared parameter in one family but not in another, right? So again, you gotta be really careful about how you make these families and how you assign parameters, okay? So now when I load this up, including this one, these two are basically the same in terms of their parameters. This is the reason why when you go to the schedule, you cannot edit this. Luckily for us, we can come in over here and go to the edit button and say, hey, you know what? I want to go ahead and add it to all the selected, and I hate the word all in here. I just wish it was just said, you know, add to elements in the selected categories. But now I can come in over here and go to the plumbing fixtures right there, and you can add it to more. If you have ADA compliant planting, you can do that as well. I wouldn't do it, okay? I'm gonna do it anyways, because I just can. And now when I come in over here, look at this, beautiful, okay? Just like that. Now, where did that actually show up? If I go to Manage and I go to Project Parameters, there's your ADA compliant. See that? That's where it put it. Let me just undo this real quick, okay? If I go to Manage Project Parameters, it's not there. You see that? It's not there. So it adds it as a project parameter, but when we say add as a project parameter, it basically does this for you. It goes and it picks the shared parameter, it goes to select, it picks that, it does that for you, but it basically writes it into your project. But by me coming in over here and going here and saying, hey, I'm gonna come in here and add it to the plumbing fixtures, like so. When I do that, it's now available. Oops, 1, 2, whatever I want to do. And if I come to Manage and I go to Project Parameters, there it is, as I mentioned before. When I go to Modify, see what it did? You see that? It's already a shared parameter. Does that make sense? So it basically bakes that into your project. And so if I go load up other plumbing fixtures from other manufacturers or ones that I make, that field will be available to the plumbing fixtures category. Does that make sense? So those are, again, those are important things to kind of keep in mind. Any questions about that? Yeah. Ah, that's a great question. So have you ever done this before? I've been guilty of this before. Like, I go into a family. Actually, one of the ones that drives me crazy is that chipboard, that detail component. You know what I'm talking about? And it loads up like 12 different sizes of chipboard, and all you care about is 5/8, right? And so what do? You go and you purge all the other sizes out, and you're like, sweet, now I only have 5/8. And you go hit Edit Family. And then you don't pay any attention, you make like a little change, you hit Save, and you saved it back to your server. What happened? You overwrote that family, and you no longer have the other chipboard sizes available to you, so when the next person loads that family, oh yeah. That's why you have IT folks that lock the server down so you cannot overwrite the families on your, I've done that a million times, trust me. We've all done that, I mean, we have. So let's take a look at this because I know the answer already because I was doing this before. If I come to Edit Family, see that? It doesn't write it into there, and I'm totally cool with that. Because again, I look at that as a project-specific decision. I may not necessarily, now, the toilet's kind of a different one. This is not, I don't know if this is, I have to look at the seat height to see if that's actually even ADA compliant, but it does not bake that back into that family so that if I save it on my server and load it next time, it's not available. If you need it and want it inside the family, you have to add the shared parameter from within the family itself. Does that make sense? Okay. So great question because that comes up a lot. If you go to Edit a Family, you'll see a lot of that information show up in that family, but in this case it does not. Make sense? Okay. here's another situation here, and I'll be done in just a moment here. 2 parameters, the same name. Okay, so here's another example that I was telling you about. Take a look at this. This is just super maddening. To ADA compliance, right? You saw that earlier. And again, the reason why that is available for both is because one of them was created in the family, and then one was created as a project shared parameter. All right? Yeah. So again, the things you need to be very well aware of, that's super bad. It was a family shared parameter, yep. That's exactly it. So again, why do we vet our families? For situations like these. Again, if you create as a family parameter, you're not going to even see it show up in the schedule, but if you create as a shared parameter inside the family, when you load it up into your project, that's going to happen. Correct. That is correct. Yep, that's exactly it. And that happens, what, all the time? Absolutely. So just be well aware of that. So I'm out of time. We could spend all day talking about parameters. I hope you guys learned some new stuff. But anyhow, if you have any questions, come find me. Oh, yeah.
What can you explain to us about machine readability of parameters in Revit and how that should be managed so that we can extract the data and feed it to robotics?
That,
You're welcome.
yeah. Let's chat offline because I may not have the answer for you. But, because, yeah, let's chat later. But again, it's going to probably deal more with shared parameters if you want to take it out to another database. So thanks, you guys. Appreciate it.